Shabbat Shalom. I'm so happy to be with everybody tonight, and I want to thank Michael Levine and Larry Kay for leading such a beautiful service. Of course, I'm not actually here tonight. I'm on the synagogue annual retreat, the first time in 3 years that we're able to be together at Isabella Friedman. But I am here tonight to teach some words of Torah. This week's parashah is Acharei, found close to the end of the book of Vayikra of Leviticus. It is the parashah that has the famous pasuk in it, the famous verse upon which so much damage has been based in the thousands of years since the Chumash, the Bible, was written and then codified. This verse is the source of the anti-gay, anti-LGBT, anti-trans legislation experience that we're having throughout the United States right now. It's the source of thousands of years of religious oppression of LGBT people. It's the source of so much hate. It's one verse, it's repeated, but in this parsha, it's the one verse in Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 22. V'et zachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha tolevahi. It is wrong, the verse tells us, a man should not lie with another man as if he were lying with a woman. This is an abomination. That one verse, repeated I know, but that one verse is what Jewish scholarship, Christian scholarship looks to over and over again as the source for religious bigotry to LGBT people. So let's take a moment in this week's parsha to spend some time with this verse and its legacy. First of all, let's make a distinction between what we might call fundamental Christianity and fundamental Judaism. These two huge swaths of religion share much in common, but they don't share the belief that every word in the original Bible is to be taken literally, even though that is sometimes the way it is portrayed. Of course, for many Christians, the way they talk and as fundamentalists about the Bible is that no word in the original Bible can ever be changed. But even the most Orthodox, the most traditional Jew, believes that the written law, the Torah Shebechtav, must be understood through the lens of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, which likewise was given by God. So, many examples of this exist, as I know everybody here knows, but to go over it quickly, we have in the Bible any number of laws that we no longer apply, even in the most traditional communities, because we've come to understand them differently. I'll give you an example. Very, very famous law in the Bible is ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Nowhere in Jewish law today would we say it's okay for somebody to blind another person who is blinded them. The Bible's quite clear. If you look at that pasuk, at that verse, it's quite literal. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And that is the source of some religious traditions throughout the world in which a thief has their hand cut off. American law, British law, which in many ways emerges in some part from some of these laws, developed in the same ways the way that Jewish law developed. After the Bible was codified and complete, the rabbinic law, the rabbinic tradition started to ask questions to understand better what the biblical tradition was trying to teach us. The rabbis very quickly said, there is no way that the words an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth means literally an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, because the rabbis said, my eye might be worth something different than your eye. If my livelihood is based on having sight, and your livelihood does not need to have sight, if you take out my eye, and I needed my eyes in order to have eyesight, my taking out your eyes wouldn't be a fair response, a fair exchange. So what the rabbis said was the creation of the laws that would develop compensation rather than physical damage that would exactly mirror the original crime. So if I do damage to you, according to a Jewish court, I have to pay financial damages that would equal what your suffering is and what you are losing in terms of livelihood. There's one exception in American law, by the way, and American law functions that way too. If I'm physically damaged, I don't get to physically damage you. There's one exception to that in American law, which is called lex talionis, and that is capital punishment. In America, it's still legal if somebody commits murder to be killed by the state in an act of state-sponsored murder in response. Some of us are working very hard to get rid of what we think is a vestige of absolute state terror, I believe. So if the Bible, according to rabbinic tradition, outlaws my taking your eye if you took my eye, or my taking your tooth if you took my tooth, we understand as a Jewish tradition, we change biblical laws all the time. We do it with a tradition of respect towards those original laws, and we study them and understand them and try to understand what was at the core, what was at the root of trying to understand what that law was getting at. But there are many examples of how the biblical words of the Bible are understood by the rabbis, and we then practice quite differently than what it looks like in the Bible. For instance, another famous example, the Bible tells us to observe Shabbat, but it doesn't tell us how to observe Shabbat. It doesn't tell us to sing the prayers that we're singing tonight. It doesn't tell us to light Shabbat candles. It doesn't tell us to make Kiddush. All of the things that we associate with Shabbat, the Bible is silent. Those traditions have been developed in thousands of years since the Bible itself. So too, the question has to be asked. Why should we read literally the words, V'yet zachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha, a man should not lie with a man as with a woman, it's an abomination? Shouldn't we have the ability to re-understand that text in a way that helps us read it quite differently? Now, there are different responses people have to difficult biblical texts, and there are many. Some people in the liberal Jewish world advocate kind of a whiteout. Remember whiteout? For those of you who remember the actual liquid, you'd pour the liquid on a piece of paper and you'd white out text you needed to correct. So some people have advocated kind of a whiteout approach to the Bible. Words we don't like, use whiteout and just get rid of it. Other people say we should whisper those words. We shouldn't say them out loud, but in order to acknowledge that they're painful, we should whisper them. And a famous example of that, which we do and up until this day, is when we read the Torah out loud on Shabbat morning. When we come to a section of the Torah that has a lot of curses in them, traditionally that section of the Torah is read in a whisper to acknowledge the curses are difficult and painful to read, and we want to give them, we don't want to white them out, but we want to read them a little differently to acknowledge the pain that they represent. So I believe, as in our Jewish tradition, there needs to be a grappling with the text. I'm opposed to whiting out things we disagree with. I do believe in engagement with the text and to constantly ask of ourselves as modern Jews, as an LGBTQ community, how to understand what God is telling us in these words. V'yet zachar lo tishkav. By the way, because the verse itself only speaks to men, and it says what a man should and shouldn't do, according to Jewish rabbinic tradition, lesbianism and male homosexuality are treated very differently. Male homosexuality is considered a more severe violation, but because women aren't mentioned in this text, lesbianism isn't as severe in Jewish tradition. That's just a little piece of interesting information. I believe one of the things this text is teaching us, V'yet zachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha to'evahi, is that we should not try and pretend to be somebody we're not. A man should not lie with a man as if he is lying with a woman. In other words, don't go into the world pretending you're a straight person if you're not. Don't go into the world pretending you're cis if deep down inside you know you're not. It is a toeva, it is an abomination to God if we don't live fully the person who we've been created by God to be. So I believe this text, this week, this parashah is telling us Don't pretend to be straight if you're not. Don't pretend to be LGBT if you're not. Don't pretend for the purpose of pleasing God. There are many social pressures that exist and fear that many of us have. But God, I believe, is telling us in this verse, it is a to'eva, it is an abomination, when we don't fully embrace, even with the questioning and with the doubting, the person that God has created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of the Holy One to be on this planet. So I pray that each of us can embrace with pride and not with shame, with a sense of welcoming and not a sense of rejection, all of who we are. To struggle and aspire to be the best version of who we are. To keep trying to emerge into the light as the person that we know God wants us to be. To not settle. To not give in or give up on the transformation of our lives and of ourselves. To recognize none of us are perfect. We're all broken vessels trying to do the best in a very broken world. But every day, we can become more of who God wants us to be. We can become more true to ourselves. We can become kinder. We can become more generous. We can become more mindful. We can become more loving. We can bring more light. Each of us, every single day. I pray that this is a week of increasing and not decreasing, and of celebrating God's presence in all of our lives. Shabbat Shalom.